My first question is, maybe quickly we could just start along here and each ask you, how how do you get started in, like, not how did you find your way into it, but what would be the first steps in a 3D print process for you? Where would you start?
Um, Lots of Googling, probably. Googling and asking mentors for help and instruction where to lead off. Um, a prototype, as I said, like just, draw some sketches, get an idea, and play around with your experiments. Don't be afraid of if you'll pass or fail. Just have fun with it, and you know, I think that's how I approach it, is by thinking of it as a stepping stone. Um, Pass it on.
Because is that on? Because I'm relying on others for the tech, for me, it really has to do with going to the source, finding the context that makes it possible for me. And that was originally North Forge, at the time called DescentWorks. And then really just taking the time, making the effort to seek the resources, and hopefully also being somewhat instrumental in making it more accessible, or at least being able to make my students more aware of those resources. And that's, for me, a lot of the motivation here, because I am a teacher and also a researcher. I feel that it is, in fact, my responsibility, even if I don't end up being really tech savvy digitally, that at least I can point my students to all of those resources.
I've got one. We'll share these. They'll share this one. For me, I'm sort of, everything kind of starts research based, where I just kind of get an idea, and then just sort of, one of the things, not, being in Winnipeg, is you got to find out what's here, what's available here, and there's lots of resources here. And again, like all of us, we kind of made our way over to AscentWorks, now known as North Forge. Video Pool also has a 3D printer as well. So if you're already a member who's working in video and thinks, oh, something completely different I want to try, that Video Pool also has the resources. There's also a hackerspace. I don't know if people are familiar with it. Is it still called Skullspace? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think they have 3D printers, but that's another resource in Winnipeg. They're kind of different in that they're really kind of into the build it yourself, make it your own. So it's a bit of a different, instead of sort of industrial sized printing machines or industrial sized laser etching machines or anything like that. They're kind of into, like, how do you make a machine? So that's another resource as well.
I hear that question often, was when someone comes to the Women in 3D Printing meeting that we have, and they're curious. They have never used a 3D printer, and they ask what should they do as their first step to learn more about 3D printing. I don't want to sound too self-serving, but we do at North Forge, the Fabrication Lab on Adelaide Street, we do have basic 3D printing training, and that's what I took when I first wanted to learn how to use it. And just meeting other people and having that community of support. If you get stuck, you have a question, or you're not sure how to do something, there's likely someone else around who's done it and who can help you out. I know the Winnipeg Library also has 3D printers. I don't know if they have training, but that's also a resource where you could go there and try out 3D printing at the library.
we're actually part of this series of workshops that we're going to be doing. We're going to be compiling local resources. We've got a very brief one here, and we're going to collect a bunch more of the links and information, and we'll have those on the Creative Manitoba website as sort of a 3D printing resource page that you'll be able to. We'll have it sometime next week, and we'll continue to do this as we do these different series. But we'll compile it. We've got one that you can take away right now. It's got Video Pool, North Forge, Skull Space, and the Idea Mill at the library links on there. So we'll do that. My next question, why don't we start down there with you, Marnie, would be what the modeling software is clearly an important part of the process. What can you talk about the kind of software that you like to play with or that you find accessible or works for your needs?
So, to be honest, it's taken me about 5 years until I started to try 3D modeling. I was honestly, like I was 5 years where I would find a model and 3D print it, but I wasn't 3D modeling. I was intimidated to try it, and I didn't know which, like there's so many different 3D modeling softwares. I didn't know which one to try, and it wasn't until this year the community of support that I have around 3D printing, they all started talking about Autodesk Fusion 360, and that being the easiest one to try. So this year I applied for a license through Autodesk as a startup, and I got a free license for a year. So I've been teaching myself Fusion 360. I did take one course on it. It was a 3-hour course on Fusion 360. There's a lot of tutorials on Autodesk on how to use it. I didn't bring any samples or photos of my prints after using Fusion 360, but I was successful to get to a point of 3D printing something that I'm not sure what it is, but it was my first print that I did with Fusion 360. So anyways, that's software I would recommend, because if I can figure out how to use it, really anyone can.
Okay, open source software is Blender. I have not used it. I personally find the learning curve for Blender for my own didn't work for me. Let's just put it that way. I use Rhino or Rhinoceros. It's that software I showed you when I was spinning the hammer scan. I use my scanner instead of building. I do build stuff originally, like from scratch, but I do use the scanner because I kind of find it kind of fun to just sort of scan something and then plop it into the software and just play with it and just sort of see what I can kind of come up with. Is Google, there used to be Google SketchUp. Does that still exist?
It exists. They sold it to another company, but it is still open source.
Okay, open source. So that's another available software. Those are the only ones I know. Anyone else? Oh yeah. Also, Photoshop, Adobe Photoshop. You can do 3D building. You can build 3D models in Adobe Photoshop now too. So you might, if you've got that, it has, you can start with just like squares and circles and start putting stuff together. Squares and circles, cubes and spheres. Sorry, 3D, not 2D.
I'm just going to add, I don't know if there's anybody here who is at a very, very basic level, but one of the big advantages of going to Teeth on 3D is that they actually forced me to sit in front of a computer and learn Tinkercad. So that is not a bad place to start. And, it has its limitations, of course, but I think there can be a lot of fear and intimidation. I can totally relate to the 5-year syndrome, and I think just to break through that, to have non-intimidating people on hand, and not embarrass you and make you feel small. So I think at least it's a way to gain some understanding. It was pretty much invaluable to me.
Um, yeah, I would recommend Fusion 360 as well for a good starter. Um, it's pretty generally well used for 3D printing. I'm not sure about sculpting a whole lot. I know you mentioned ZBrush, and I heard that ZBrush is a very viable option too, but I'm not sure how well it translates for uh, exporting G code into 3D printers. So my knowledge is very limited in that, but yeah, it's all just do a little bit of research, which software matches with which um, program for extruding your 3D prints. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we can open it up to a conversation. The question of ethics in digital technology kind of comes up. Can you just talk a little bit about what your thoughts are? Are there dangers, or are there cautionary steps that need to be taken to make sure that 3D printing is used in an ethical way, whether it's the materials? There's a lot of talk about plastic waste. Is that a problem? Are there different substrates that can be used? Or perhaps in your case, Chris, is bridging that cultural divide between Indigenous cultural teachings and modern processes and stuff like that. So just sort of what are your thoughts? Are there thoughts off the top of your head around the ethics of 3D printing?
Well, in my case, I think it's very important to have that defined line between the traditional and contemporary sort of artwork. But I also think that we shouldn't shy away from combining them and maybe expanding on the culture for that. That's what I have for that point. The ethics of the material, the waste is a bit marginal. I see a lot of waste being tossed around, and maybe in the future there'll be a better method for 3D printers. Maybe they'll be more efficient. Uh, I guess it all depends up to the user how they use the 3D printer. A lot of time people uh, the machines they sometimes have accidents, I guess, and they'll ruin your print, and that whole project you spent on like a bottle, printing a bottle, and fail, and you'd have to toss it all out. So I don't think you can do much other than recycling. So just be careful, I guess.
For me, I would say the ethics mostly revolve around are you cheating? Is it real? And in terms of the field I work in, ceramics, again, there's a lot of questions around why would you do it? Is there any real sort of legitimacy if you're not the one making it directly? And I don't actually adhere to that sort of philosophy, because to me it's another tool in the toolkit and a means to an end ultimately. And it's exciting. It's a way to create reiterations, maybe a little bit more easily than you could on your own. And a lot of it, of course, you simply could not create by hand. So there's a lot of questions around that, which I alluded to earlier. The other part of it would be definitely the materials, the toxicity. The powder printing has just a massive amount, especially with the stoneware. Clay, massive amounts of silica dust floating around, and even at Thom, a very high-end production facility, they weren't particularly careful about that. Again, I work in ceramics, so of course I'm very aware of health hazards and the precautions that have to be taken. So I would hope that just in future there will be more attention paid to that. And in terms of waste, plastics, I suppose there could be certainly questions around that as well. Doing it directly in clay, maybe that's one way to minimize the guilt that I would experience that way. So yeah, I think that's a very good question that I would and will be thinking about.
For me, it's I kind of think about the objects and the idea of replicating an object and the idea of copyright or copyleft or no copyright. The idea of I'm sure people have heard in the past, this hasn't really come up very much anymore, no one's really talking about it, but the idea of the 3D printed gun, that was quite the conversation a while ago, and the idea of the additivist cookbook has a bunch of projects. I don't think the gun's in that one, but there's ideas of sort of being able. So, okay, let me just stop for a second. Okay, for me, I find it interesting of the idea that the 3D printing can be very subversive, and that you can kind of own your own means of production, but at the same time thinking about pumping out plastic objects over and over and over again. That's a difficult thing, but I'm sure Marnie is going to let us know exactly, since she's just come back from a conference on the industry, as to all the different kinds of materials there are, because it doesn't have to be you're printing in plastic. There's tons of other things you can print. But going back to the actual objects, one of the things, I'm just going to say this quickly, but one of the things that when I was researching a few years ago, is that the idea that 3D printing was going to make it so that we'd all, if your part of your phone broke, you would go to a store and you'd get the part, the documents, and then you'd 3D print the part. And it's like it was going to change manufacturing forever, and we'd all have all of this fix my mouse wheel or something like that. And what's interesting, I find, is that industry just did not like that. And you never saw these sort of fix-it-yourself kind of stores. So that kind of like that utopian ideal just sort of went. But I don't know. I think it's subversive. I think it has its challenges. It has its bad things. It has its good things. Yeah.
Erica's example with the iPhone parts, it is 3D printing additive manufacturing is reducing a ton of parts being warehoused in large industries like railroad, aerospace, like rather than, and this is starting to take place now, rather than having a warehouse full of extra parts for railroad cars, they're being printed on demand now. So it's reducing a lot of waste that way. I heard last week good news from a sustainability and biomaterial perspective, that a lot of larger 3D print vendors are developing materials to be sustainable, bio recyclable materials, which is good news because I hadn't really heard that before. And there's some 3D print companies that have materials that, like the whole 360 workflow in place where they're recycling excess material and being able to reuse it again. And even 3D printed parts that fail, they can reuse those parts, like melted or whatever the process is, but they're reusing the material in a full, 360 workflow, which is good news.
Yeah, that's great news. Thank you. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? Can I just get you to come? We're just making a sort of a podcast of this, so if you want to just come and grab the microphone and ask your question.
Hi, this is a question, I guess, more for Erica and Marnie. So one thing that I've seen within 3D printing is scale and restrictions of scale. As a person who works with large installation and that sort of thing, that's one thing that's attractive to me, is wanting to get into 3D printing, but to take it to a larger kind of level. So would you be able to talk about the accessibility of industrial strength 3D printers? Erica, you briefly mentioned industry kind of 3D printers, and I've seen videos of people like 3D printing houses and that sort of thing. But I'm just wondering how the public can kind of get into that or access it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, there are some very large format 3D printers out there. Big Rep is one of them for very large prints. I don't know of any that large in Manitoba. We do have Fortis 3D printer, so your 3D print is will only be as large as the print bed, and you can make several prints and glue them together. I've seen that before. And you see a seam, but then you can paint it.
One thing. The robotic arm. A lot of one ways you can sort of get out of the idea of the 3D printed box thing is that you have this robotic arm that can build, and I'm sure you've seen those huge robotic arms that build extruded concrete houses and stuff like that. So I think there's room for tinkerers who want to try to build things like that. But then, I guess the engineering and everything starts to come in. If you build it, you can build it, you can make it, maybe. I don't know.
And at University of Manitoba, you said that they built a clay extruder.
It is, yeah, in fact, a printer head for a robotic arm. Yeah, the robotic arm, though, sits on a tabletop. So it's, still limited capacity. But as I said earlier, it's very new still. And the technicians are just starting to move into printing using the printer head. And I'll be actually collaborating with them next semester on a project for students. Because I think this is a very good question, Casey, in terms of scale, also cost, and that is of total relevance to students for sure. And, how do you then reconcile that without it being only small object oriented? So it's still very new, but again, I would hope for bigger and better coming up.
I guess for Grace, it's a long tradition in art that, from what I understand, that
Alex, can't hear you very well. That's better.
there's a long tradition in art where people that work with technology, or people would work with assistants like Michelangelo. All these people had tons of, I guess, extended warmware. So the idea of being the one that is the creative person that that comes up with the ideas and explores things and works with other people, I don't think anyone has to feel bad about that. There wouldn't be a film made without a group of people collaborating, each bringing their aspect into it. And in fact, I think that's what makes it exciting. And that's why I think this group is really interesting, because I'm working in my bedroom essentially, and it's like, it's hard to keep track of whatever's going on, and it's inspiring to see what other people are doing. Yeah, and the idea of collaborating, which each person brings something to it, I think is important. And the idea of working vertically, like you can work on VR, and in order to do that, you need to learn lighting, sculpture, painting, photography. And so you can print some stuff, you can, other stuff could be used in other ways. So it's not just about making objects, it's one aspect of a lot of ways of approaching.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Do we have any last questions, comments? Oh,
At North Forge, if I come in and want something printed, is there like a cost, or how
We're
does?
Yeah, good question. We're not a print service. How it works is people join as a member, they learn how to use the equipment, and they do it themselves. But if you don't want to do that, or if you don't have time, or you would like someone else to print something for you, there is it's a rapid prototyping form on northforge.ca that you can fill out. It goes out to our members, and if someone has the resources and the ability to help you out, then they'll contact you.
It's a really good, I have to say, it's really good. I just have to say that, across Canada, there are not a lot of fab labs, and Winnipeg has probably one of the best outside of the universities, because there's fab labs in universities, but to have a community-based fab lab is just an amazing thing. And so for this organization to exist is just superb. And yeah, you're not going to find them. It's quite a unique thing. It's quite a treasure to have.
awesome.
Plug.